My name is Lauren Mercer. I'm 32 years old. And on a Thursday morning in March, I sat across a conference table from my father for the first time in 14 years. He was trying to sell me his company. He didn't know it was me until I walked through the door. He looked up from his documents and I watched his face do something I had never seen it do in all the years I lived under his roof. It collapsed. Just for a moment, just long enough for everyone in the room to feel the air change. Then he straightened in his chair and picked up his pen, because that is the kind of man Frank Mercer is. He does not let people see him fall apart. He passed that particular trait directly to me, and I have always found that quietly funny. I set my portfolio on the table. I sat down. I looked at him the way I look at every counterparty in every acquisition meeting I have ever run. Steady, prepared, professionally warm. I said, "Hello, Frank, not Dad. Frank, I've reviewed the financials. Should we get started?" What he didn't know, what no one in that room knew except me, was that I had been building toward that chair for 14 years. Not toward that specific chair, not toward him, toward the kind of woman who sits in it without apology, without permission, and without anyone having handed her a single thing. This is that story. I grew up in a beige colonial house on Sycamore Ridge Drive in Dayton, Ohio. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a 2-car garage where my father kept tools he treated with more tenderness than he ever quite managed with me. The house sat on a corner lot, and Frank mowed the lawn himself every Saturday morning from May through October, which was how you knew things were going well, when the lawn looked good. Frank was in a good mood, and the house felt like something close to safe. Frank Mercer built Mercer Construction, Inc. from nothing. He will tell you this within 4 minutes of meeting him. He started with a pickup truck, a used flatbed trailer, and a commercial paint contract for a strip mall in 1989. By the time I was born, he had 16 employees. By the time I was old enough to remember anything clearly, he had 53 employees, a real office building on Industrial Parkway, and a framed photograph on his office wall of himself shaking hands with the mayor at the ribbon cutting of a new courthouse addition that Mercer Construction had built. He pointed to that photograph whenever he wanted to make a point about what hard work could accomplish. I must have been shown that photograph 40 times before I turned 18. The thing about Frank is that he loved the idea of building something from nothing. He loved the story of it. What he did not love, what I only fully understood much later, was the idea of someone else in his orbit telling a similar story, especially not someone who was supposed to be grateful, manageable, and quietly appreciative of what he had already built. My mother left when I was 11. I won't go deeply into that except to say she left for reasons that made sense to me even at 11, and that her leaving created a particular vacuum in that house that Frank filled 3 years later with a woman named Donna. Donna Cantrell became Donna Mercer 2 weeks after my 15th birthday. She was 50 at the time, careful about her appearance, drove a white Mercedes she kept immaculate, and had the specific kind of quiet that isn't peaceful. It's strategic. She never raised her voice at me. Not once. She didn't need to. She had a dozen smaller tools at her disposal. The way she would pause just half a second too long before including me in plans. The way she rearranged the kitchen and then looked mildly exasperated when I couldn't find things. The way she would say, "I just think Lauren would be happier with more independence." In Frank's presence, consistently for 3 years, until the idea had been planted so many times it became his own thought. I want to give you 2 specific examples so you understand what the air in that house felt like. When I was 16, I was accepted into a summer architecture program at Ohio State. It ran for 6 weeks and was competitive. I was one of 22 students selected statewide. I came home with the acceptance letter and found Donna in the kitchen. I told her. She looked at the letter, handed it back, and said, "Your father will want to discuss whether that's the right use of summer." She turned back to the stove. That was it. No congratulations. The word discuss made it clear the answer would be no. Frank said the program was too far, too long, and that I should be learning something practical. I did not go. When I was 17, I got a job waitressing at a diner 2 miles from the house. I was saving for a laptop I needed for school. Donna waited 3 weeks and then mentioned to Frank, I heard it through the kitchen wall, that she was concerned about the kind of people I was meeting at work and that she wasn't sure it was a safe environment for a girl my age. Frank told me to quit. I did not quit. That was the first time I did not comply. I remember it as the moment the atmosphere in the house changed permanently. By the time I was 18, the arrangement was clear to everyone, including me. Donna had decided I did not belong there. Frank had accepted that conclusion, and the only remaining question was the occasion on which it would become official. The occasion turned out to be my 18th birthday. I had been accepted to an urban planning program at the University of Michigan. It was a competitive program, 4 hours from home, and it was exactly what I wanted to study. I had applied without telling Frank because I already knew what he would say. I had already been told twice that I would be attending the business administration program at Wright State, 10 minutes from the house, where Frank could monitor my proximity and I could work part-time in the Mercer construction office doing administrative filing. I accepted Michigan's offer on a Tuesday. I left the acceptance letter on my desk. I did not hide it. I simply did not think he would go into my room. He went into my room. On the morning of my 18th birthday, a Sunday in April, I came downstairs to find 3 black garbage bags sitting on the front lawn. My clothes were in one. My books were in another. Everything else I owned was in the third. The Hendersons from across the street were outside doing yard work. Both of them stopped. Mrs. Henderson had her hand over her mouth. Frank was standing on the front porch. He said, "You want to be so independent? You've been telling me for 3 years you don't need this family. Fine, now you don't have it. You want to be on your own. Be on your own. Don't come back here asking for anything." Then he went inside and closed the door. He did not look back. I stood there for a moment. The Hendersons had not moved. I picked up all 3 bags, 2 in my left hand, 1 in my right, because I did not want to make 2 trips, and I walked to the bus stop 2 blocks away. I sat on the bench. I checked my wallet, $47. The bus came at 9:47 in the morning. I got on. I did not cry until I was seated and the door had closed and I was moving away from that street, and I was certain that no one who knew me could see my face. That was the last time I cried about Frank Mercer. 6 months later, I received a text from Donna. I still have it. It said, "Your father is doing well, in case you were wondering. We've redecorated. The house looks wonderful." I did not reply. I saved the text. I'm not entirely sure why. Perhaps because I knew, even at 18, that documentation was a form of power. 2 years after that, my cousin Sarah, who had always stayed loosely in touch with me, called to tell me something she had overheard at a family barbecue. Frank had been talking to a friend of his, a man named Dale, who had known us since I was small, and Frank had said, "She made her choice. I gave her every opportunity and she threw it back in my face. Some kids you just cannot help. She'll figure it out eventually, or she won't. Either way, it's not my problem anymore." Sarah told me this expecting me to be hurt. I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat down and wrote myself a note on a yellow legal pad that I kept beside my bed. The note said, "What he threw away. Remember what you're making of it." I kept that legal pad for 10 years. If you're still with me, and I hope you are, I want you to drop a comment below and tell me whether there has ever been someone in your life who counted you out before you'd even started. You don't have to share details. Just tell me yes or no, because I think a lot of us have sat at that bus stop. I think more of us than anyone talks about. I put myself through the University of Michigan on waitress tips, a Pell Grant, 2 part-time jobs, and 1 academic scholarship I applied for 11 times before I won it. I graduated with a degree in urban planning in 4 years. Then I took an analyst position at a commercial real estate firm in Chicago, a company called Bridgewater Property Group, where I spent 3 years learning how acquisitions actually work from the inside. I was not the loudest person in that office. I was not the most naturally charming. I was the one who read every contract completely, who stayed until 9 p.m. when the work required it, and who never once left a number unverified. At 25, I took a second position at a smaller development firm in Columbus called Heartline Capital. Better title. Better access to deal flow. I spent 2 years there. I was promoted once. I learned how to run a site assessment, how to negotiate a purchase price down 17% over 3 weeks of patience, and how to read a distressed property's bones and know whether what's wrong with it is fixable or fundamental. At 27, I made a decision that terrified me. I found a single-family investment property in a transitional neighborhood in Columbus, a duplex that had sat vacant for 14 months and was listed at $112,000. Because the previous owner had let the plumbing deteriorate, and the cosmetic damage was significant enough to scare off buyers who didn't know the difference between expensive and merely ugly. I knew the difference. I bought it, spent $19,000 on targeted repairs over 4 months, and sold it 14 months later for $225,000. After costs and taxes, I had cleared $94,000. I had been saving since I was 18. The flip brought my total savings to $180,000. On March 3, 2028, I registered Mercer Development Group LLC with the state of Ohio. I named it after myself deliberately, not defiantly. Not as a statement to Frank, who would never know and whose opinion I had stopped tracking years earlier. I named it after myself because the name Mercer belonged to the work, and the work was mine. I built it in silence. No social media presence. No press releases. No announcements. My industry colleagues knew my name. The rest of the world did not. Frank certainly did not. The model was straightforward and it worked. I identified undervalued commercial properties, small office buildings, mixed-use lots, light industrial spaces, in markets where the fundamentals were improving faster than the prices had caught up. I acquired them, improved them, and either leased the space or resold at a premium. Each completed deal funded the next. I was careful, I was patient, I did not rush. By the end of 2028, I had 2 completed acquisitions and 1 active development. By the end of 2029, I had 5 completed acquisitions. I brought on my first employee, an operations manager named James Kowalski, 34, former project manager at a mid-sized development firm in Cincinnati. James was methodical, loyal, and had the specific gift of not asking questions that weren't his to ask. I told him on his first day that I ran a quiet shop and that I valued discretion above almost everything else. He said that suited him fine. By the end of 2030, I had 9 completed acquisitions across Ohio and Kentucky. Assets under management were approaching $2 million. I drove the same 4-year-old Subaru I had bought at 26. I had a 2-bedroom apartment I liked and a gym membership I used 4 mornings a week. I did not have a yacht. I did not have a presence on LinkedIn. I did not have any desire to explain myself to anyone who had not earned the conversation. In 2031, something shifted in the market. A particular class of mid-sized commercial property, exactly the kind Mercer Construction Inc. had been building for 3 decades, started coming under pressure. Owners who had over-leveraged during the low-interest period were finding themselves squeezed. Older companies with aging leadership and declining contract pipelines were either restructuring or looking for exits. I started seeing Frank's company on contractor bid submissions for projects in the Columbus metro area. The first time I saw the name Mercer Construction Inc. on a bid, I looked at it for a long moment. Then I read the submission the way I would read any contractor submission, looking for quality, completeness, competitive pricing. What I found was a company that had clearly been well run at some point and was now showing the specific signs of an organization whose leadership had stopped adapting. The margins they were bidding were too thin. The project timeline estimates were optimistic in ways that suggested they needed the cash flow more than they needed the accuracy. I noted the name and moved on. I did not select them for any project. I did not reach out. I did not tell anyone that the owner of that company had put 3 garbage bags on a front lawn 14 years earlier and told his daughter she was on her own. In January 2032, James came to my office on a Tuesday morning with a printed email. He set it on my desk and said a business broker named Gerald Watts had reached out regarding a potential acquisition target, a mid-size commercial construction firm with 31 years of operating history, a solid asset base, and a current owner who was exploring exit options due to what Gerald described in his email as operational challenges, and succession planning considerations. The company was called Mercer Construction, Inc. The address was on Industrial Parkway in Dayton. Frank had worked out of that building for 35 years. I looked at the email for what I think was approximately 90 seconds. James was still standing in the doorway. I looked up at him and said, "Schedule a meeting for the earliest available date. Conference at their offices." James nodded. He did not ask why I wanted to meet at their offices rather than ours, which was my usual preference. He just nodded and went to make the call. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday, March 6th at 10 o'clock in the morning. I spent the intervening 3 weeks reviewing every document Gerald Watts sent over, audited financials for the past 4 years, the asset register, the employee roster, outstanding contracts, pending liabilities. The picture that emerged was of a company that had once been genuinely good and had spent the last 5 years slowly bleeding out. The warehouse district development loss in 2031, $2.3 million on a project that had gone badly wrong due to a combination of cost overruns, a key subcontractor defaulting, and a market that moved against them, had not killed the company outright but had fractured its foundation. The debt service was unsustainable, the pipeline was thin. Gerald had reached out to 12 potential acquirers. The other 11 had passed after reviewing the same financials I was now sitting with. I did not tell James what I was thinking. I did not tell him anything about the history in that building on Industrial Parkway. I ran the numbers the way I always run numbers. I assessed the asset value, the liability exposure, the market position, the brand equity. Then I put the file on my desk and I let it sit overnight. On the morning of March 4th, 2 days before the meeting, I went to my closet and pulled out a charcoal blazer I had bought the previous year and never worn. Dark trousers. Low heels. I hung the outfit on the back of my bedroom door and looked at it for a moment. Then I went to make coffee. I drove to Dayton on the morning of March 6th. James met me in the parking lot of Mercer Construction at 9:56. The building was exactly as I remembered it from the one time my father had taken me to the office when I was 12, a low, brick, commercial building with a small landscaped entrance and a company sign above the door in green and white. The sign looked older than I remembered. The landscaping was less maintained. Gerald Watts met us in the lobby at 9:58. He was a heavy-set man in his 60s with a blue tie and the practiced warmth of someone who had spent a career managing awkward financial conversations. He shook my hand and said, "Ms. Pretz, Mercer, very glad you could make the trip." He did not register anything in the name. Why would he? The file said Mercer Development Group. He knew me only as the one interested party who hadn't walked away. He led us down a corridor I remembered. The carpet was different. The walls had been repainted at some point. He pushed open the door to the conference room. Frank was already inside. He was seated at the head of the table, the seller's position. Not the head of the room, though I knew he would not have experienced it that way. He was in a dark blazer, his hair more gray than I remembered, the lines in his face deeper. Beside him sat Phil Garrett, his attorney, silver-haired, reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead, a legal pad in front of him. Phil had represented Frank for 20 years. I knew his name from the company documents. Frank was looking down at something on the table when I walked in. Gerald said, "Frank, this is Lauren Mercer, founder and managing director of Mercer Development Group, and her operations manager, James Kowalski." Frank looked up. The room went completely silent, not the polite pause of an introduction, the kind of silence that arrives when the air in a space changes composition. Phil Garrett's pen stopped moving mid-word. Gerald looked between us with the expression of a man who has just realized he is in the middle of something he does not have the context to understand. James shifted slightly in his chair beside me. He told me later he felt the temperature drop. Frank's face moved through 4 expressions in what I estimate was 3 seconds. Confusion, because the name on the file had not prepared him. Recognition, the specific recognition of someone seeing a face they filed away long ago and did not expect to see again. Disbelief, the recalibration of every assumption he had walked into this room carrying. And then something I had genuinely never seen on his face in my entire life. Not shame exactly, not guilt, exactly. Something more functional than either of those. Something that looked like the precise moment a person understands their position. I set my portfolio on the table. I pulled out the chair across from him. I sat down. I looked at him the way I look at every counterparty in every acquisition meeting I have ever run. Steady, prepared, professionally neutral. I said, "Hello, Frank." I'd decided on that on the drive over. Not Dad, not Mr. Mercer. Frank, the way you address a counterparty whose history you know, but whose claim on your deference you do not recognize. I've reviewed the financials. Should we get started? Gerald cleared his throat. His voice came out smaller than before. You two, do you know each other? I opened my portfolio. We used to. I clicked my pen. Now. The 2031 Warehouse District loss. I want to understand the full liability exposure before we discuss valuation. Phil Garrett leaned over and said something quietly to Frank. I could not hear it. Frank nodded slowly once. He straightened in his chair. He picked up his pen. Frank did not speak for the first 40 minutes of that meeting. I ran the session. I asked every question that needed asking. I went through the liability documentation line by line. I asked about the outstanding subcontractor disputes. I asked about the 3 employees who had left in the past 18 months. I asked about the current state of the one active contract that was still generating revenue. I was thorough and I was efficient and I did not rush. James took notes beside me and asked 2 clarifying questions of his own at the 40-minute mark, which told me he had settled into the meeting and was functioning normally, which was all I needed from him. Somewhere around the 1-hour point, Frank found his voice. He answered a question about the asset register in a tone that was careful and controlled and almost but not quite normal. His eyes kept returning to my face. Each time I met his gaze directly, held it for 1 professional second, then moved back to my documents. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Phil Garrett spoke primarily on procedural matters. Gerald spoke when spoken to. James spoke when useful. Frank and I spoke to each other the way 2 parties in an acquisition speak to each other, with measured precision, with every word carrying weight, with nothing wasted. At the end, I closed my portfolio and said I would be in touch with Gerald within 3 weeks with our formal position. I stood up. James stood up. I shook Phil Garrett's hand. I shook Gerald's hand. I looked at Frank. He was still seated. He looked up at me, and for a moment I could see him trying to find something to say. Something that wasn't about the meeting. Something from whatever was happening underneath the meeting. His mouth opened slightly. I said, "Thank you for your time." I picked up my portfolio, and I walked out of that conference room, down that corridor, through that lobby, and into the parking lot where the March air was cold and clear and I could breathe it without anyone watching my face. I sat in my car for 11 minutes before I started the engine. I took the full 3 weeks. I went back to the financials. I had my attorney review the liability exposure. I had an independent assessor value the physical assets. I ran 3 different acquisition models against the numbers and let each one sit overnight before I reviewed it again in the morning. The business case was marginal, not impossible. There was a real asset base and a real operational history, and with the right management restructuring and capital injection, the company could be stabilized. But it was a harder case than most of the deals I had done, and it would require more personal involvement than I typically wanted in an acquisition. So the decision came down to something that wasn't in any spreadsheet. I thought about what it would mean to acquire Mercer Construction, Inc. I thought about 31 employees who had nothing to do with what Frank had done on a Sunday morning in April 14 years ago. I thought about Phil Garrett and his 20 years of loyalty to a man who was now cornered. I thought about the courthouse addition and the photo on the wall and the lawn that got mowed every Saturday, and the thing Frank had built. Genuinely built, with real work and real years, that was now unmistakably failing. I did not think about what he deserved. I had spent a long time not thinking about what Frank deserved because the question had never been useful to me. I thought instead about what was true. What was true was that I was a development company and he was a construction company, and if the liability exposure could be capped through the deal structure, the combination was actually strategically coherent. What was true was that I had never needed Frank's help to get to this chair, and I did not need his company to stay in it. What was also true was that I could walk away and watch Mercer Construction file for bankruptcy in 18 months, which was going to happen regardless of whether I was involved. I called Gerald Watts on a Wednesday morning 3 weeks after the meeting. I made an offer. It was a fair offer, not a punitive one, not a generous one. It reflected the real value of the assets and the real weight of the liabilities. I included a provision that Frank could remain as a non-executive operational consultant for 12 months at a reduced rate, with an option to extend if the performance metrics were met. I included a clause protecting the existing 31 employees during the integration period. I did not include a clause protecting Frank's ego or his photograph on the wall. Gerald called back 6 hours later. Frank had accepted. I signed the documents on a Friday afternoon in late March in my own office with James and my attorney present. There was no ceremony. I initialed the pages where marked, signed were required, and dated each signature. When it was done, I set the pen down and looked out the window for a moment. My office looks west. In the late afternoon, the light comes through at a low angle and sits gold on the floor. I have never spoken to Frank outside of professional contexts since that first meeting. He has appeared at 3 operational briefings where his knowledge of the legacy contracts was genuinely useful. He speaks when addressed. He does not refer to our history in front of others. I do not refer to it either. It is not a truce exactly. It is simply the shape of what's left. Donna sent me a text 2 weeks after the acquisition closed. It said, "I heard what happened. I think it's wonderful that you've done so well. Your father is proud." I read it once. I did not reply. I saved it in the same folder where I keep the first one, from 2018, the one about the redecorating. Some things you keep not because they still have power over you, but because they are accurate records of what happened. History belongs to the people who document it. I have been asked, by colleagues who eventually learned the story, by the one journalist who wrote a brief profile of Mercer Development Group last year that touched on it, whether I feel I have won. I find the question hard to answer. Not because I am being modest, but because it assumes the thing I was doing was a competition. It wasn't. The day I walked away from that house with 3 garbage bags was the day the competition Frank thought we were having ended for me. I was never trying to beat him. I was just trying to build something. My father built a company with his hands and named it after himself. So did I. The difference is I never threw anyone out for wanting to do the same. The girl at the bus stop at 9:47 in the morning with $47 in her pocket, she was not thinking about Frank when the bus started moving. She was thinking about what came next. She was already planning. She was already, in every way that mattered, on her way. The only thing Frank gave her that morning was a departure time. If you are watching this and you know what it is to be told you are not worth the investment, to be counted out not at your worst but at the exact moment you were doing something right, I want you to hear this directly. The math they did on you is wrong. Not because you are special and the world is kind, but because they were calculating based on who you were in their story, and that is not who you are in yours. You do not need their revision. You do not need their apology. You do not need to wait for the room to go silent before you know what you're worth. You build the thing. You sign the documents. You look out the window when it's done and watch the light come across the floor. That is enough. That has always been enough. If the person who hurt you most ended up needing your help, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one.